Hello. So, the first lecture in this series is entitled What is Phenomenology? Here I will talk about three things. Firstly, I'll define my understanding of phenomenology and some of its most basic principles and characteristics as a distinct philosophical method. Second, I'll briefly talk about the rise of phenomenology at the turn of the 20th century and some precursors to the movement. And third, I'll outline the way I will proceed throughout the rest of the course, as well as justify some omissions. First then, the meaning of phenomenology and some of its basic and most unique characteristics. Etymologically, the term comes from two words in ancient Greek, phenomena or phenomenon and logos. Logos has many translations, including the Word of God in the New Testament. It also means logic. Here I think study is the most appropriate in this context, as long as one takes this meaning rather seriously, as in a dedicated study, in this case of phenomena. Phenomena can also be translated as appearances, but this can be misleading if one takes appearances to be mere appearances, that is, not real ones. This is because appearances as phenomena are much broader. Some are very real, such as a chair in front of you. Some are not, like a unicorn you may imagine. And there are many more, like an idea of a triangle. These are all appearances. I prefer to stick with phenomena as opposed to appearances, and you'll learn to understand the significance more as we progress. For now, a phenomenon is basically anything that can appear to conscious awareness, from actual chairs to unicorns to ideas. So it incorporates the whole of a human conscious experience. Thus, phenomenology is a disciplined study of all phenomena, of all appearances. Another key element to note is that phenomenology is more about how rather than what. This is very true, provided it is understood correctly. What something is often the point of departure for many empirical and theoretical sciences. For example, heat is molecular motion, water is H2O. This is what things are. Phenomenology, for its part, focuses more on how something appears to me, a conscious subject. In other words, how I experience heat, water, and so on all different levels: immediate feeling, imagination, scientific abstraction, really perceiving, and so on. This is not to say that phenomenology is not interested in what. It is simply to say that its main methodological point of departure is this how, which also means it departs from an immediate first-person perspective rather than a more static and distant third-person one. The third-person one is done in many other disciplines, both inside and outside of philosophy. Essential to attaining this how is what is known as the epoche and the reduction. This is a complex issue. Here I may just say that the epoche is Greek for bracketing or suspending. So to get to the how, I bracket or suspend what a thing is, what a thing might be in itself, a chair, for example, as a collection of certain atoms, for instance. By doing this, I reduce my focus to the immediately lived experience, how this chair is appearing to me right now. In this sense, reduction might be an okay term. I, however, often think it is a bit misleading because the bracketing also leads to an emphasis of the significance of one's immediate experiences, wherethrough we also will get to ultimate structures of these experiences as well. Phenomenology is thus an emphasized and persistent focus on the tonalities and structures of one's immediate everyday experiences. One of Husserl's most famous mottos was to return or go back to the things themselves. For phenomenology, much of philosophy had strayed too far from understanding the concrete and everyday. In short, that which is right in front of one in body and mind. Phenomenology is thus a dedicated call to get back to this. Now, phenomenology states that within all experiences, there is a constant, intentionality. Intentionality is the phenomenological law that conscious awareness is always awareness of something. This something, this X, we call an object. This must be understood in the widest possible sense, object, in that I can be aware of very many different objects and types of objects. I can be aware of things like perceptual things, real things. I can be aware of images, ideas, and so forth. This intentionality is an ineradicable law of conscious structures of experience in phenomenology. Consciousness is always consciousness of something. The law of intentionality then automatically implies two essential aspects or sides to any lived experience, noesis and noema. Again, ancient Greek terms, the former, which has an adjective noetic, is the subjective side, the mode one's consciousness is in at any given moment. For example, perception. I am perceiving. The latter, and the adjective is noematic, is the objective side, namely the objects that appear to that particular mode of consciousness. For example, now I see a room, a table, chairs, and so on in my perception. The result is that there are various modes of consciousness that each have their own sets of objects, and therefore also their own laws and structure. And we will see this starting with Husserl in the next lecture. Phenomenology is one of the disciplines of the 20th century and continues very strongly to this day, as we will see. It broke onto the scene with Husserl's Logical Investigations, published precisely in 1900. Along with psychoanalysis, Freud's interpretation of dreams, for instance, was also 1900, and the rise of analytical philosophy. For example, Wittgenstein's Tractatus was 1921. Phenomenology was by far one of the most dominant and influential disciplines of the 20th century, and has left lasting and ongoing influence on all levels of society, I would argue. Indeed, even many of the biggest explicit and systematic existentialist thinkers like Heidegger and Sartre, I will have another course on this, a separate course. Even these existentialist thinkers have decidedly phenomenological roots. Phenomenology stands out from pretty much all other philosophical theoretical disciplines because it largely remains very hands-on and concrete. Departing from first-hand experience and dedicated to descriptive observation thereof, it seeks to build a theory of experience covering all possible modes of experience and all possible objects. It was and remains an ambitious and important project, for if we understand our experiences more fully, we can also know our place better in the world, how it and we work, and what we need to do going forward. In this sense, phenomenology can be seen as most closely related to the historical philosophical tradition of empiricism, which has the senses as the source of all knowledge. However, depending on the phenomenologist, and starting particularly with Husserl, phenomenology ultimately seeks structures and uses insights that make it a theory that is considerably more complex and layered than most empiricisms. What remains, though, is that phenomenology departs from and seeks to foundationally understand everyday experience in all of its kinds and details. Like any discipline, phenomenology has its precursors and influences. I've already mentioned empiricism. What is also noteworthy is phenomenology's sustained effort to get to the essence of what a thing is, whether this be a particular object or experience or both. This goes back in philosophy all the way to the beginning in figures like Plato, in that it can be said to be one of the essential characteristics of any philosophy. Indeed, Descartes' famous method of description and methodological doubt in order to get to an undoubtable core of basic experience was something else that was highly influential to Husserl and other phenomenologists. In this manner, each discipline and subdomain has its own way of getting to a certain core, with phenomenology usually getting to the essence of what something is by primarily focusing on how it appears to me and what this means. Within phenomenology, this is done in differing ways, with different phenomenologists on very different points of the realism-idealism axis, namely the stances that all phenomena ultimately depend on the mind, that's idealism, or that they don't depend on the mind, realism. So for instance, Husserl was a major proponent of idealism, whereas Sartre, as we will see, argues for a kind of realism. This debate and nuance has a long history too, and one could say it crescendoed with the transcendental idealism of Immanuel Kant, which is a legacy that phenomenology takes up in earnest too. Finally, although the terms that make up phenomenology date back to ancient Greece, the term was explicitly and prominently used once before phenomenology in a key work by a famous philosopher, namely Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit from 1807. Although most would agree that Hegel's philosophy, being more of an abstract and theoretical idealism, is not phenomenology in the more concrete and hands-on meaning of the 20th century, it shows that even the term and idea was around before it came to full fruition and contextualization at the beginning of the 20th century. The most immediate and obvious precursor and important precursor to phenomenology is Franz Brentano's descriptive psychology. And indeed, without Husserl attending these lectures as a budding mathematician, it is doubtful phenomenology would have arisen as it did. Descriptive psychology is an apt term in the sense that through faithful and detailed description, one comes to understand the basic laws and complexity of the mind, of the psyche. Phenomenology took up this descriptive method in earnest, and although some early works, most notably Husserl's logical investigations, remained rather close to this view and method in places, phenomenology was a decidedly new discipline because not only or not least because of the law of intentionality, consciousness is always consciousness of something, the mind always already implied so much more than itself, not least the world and its universe of objects, both physical and mental. Phenomenology thus quickly became a descriptive science because Wissenschaft in German, because it automatically went way beyond merely the principles of the mind and also into the world itself as well. The overarching aim of this course is to give you a solid and interesting introduction into phenomenology by explicating its main elements, claims, and foci. In order to do this, I've decided to take an author-centered approach that proceeds in a more or less chronological fashion. I think this way is the best, so you can see the main elements that develop over time through each main author, as well as how they differ and what new thinkers bring to the table. Of course, being an introduction, I had to be selective, and so I have left out some themes, even on the authors I concentrate on, as well as authors that, although are significant then and now in phenomenology, they are less well known and influential, and are therefore a bit less relevant to an introductory course. I list a few intriguing phenomenologists here that I've left out, and of course there are others. You are of course free to look them up, and I can particularly recommend Shaler for anyone interested in a phenomenological theory of values and valuing. This course will be taught primarily through lectures like this one, and the length will vary depending on how long it takes to cover the main points. Today, for instance, was maybe a bit shorter than the others will be. I will have a few recommended readings at the end of each lecture, which of course you can pursue if interested, as well as a small quiz for each lecture in order to help you retain some of the main basic points. I also have an idea for an assignment at the end of the course for anyone that wishes to carry it out on their own in order to bring the course as a whole together. Here are the recommended readings for this week. I sincerely hope you enjoy the course, and I'll see you next time.